Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's program. All participants are in listen-only mode. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature on WebEx. However, if your question is not answered during the session, our presenters will follow up with you directly in the coming days. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. Now, I'll pass it over to our moderator for today's program, Masa Aleskari.
Thank you very much, Andy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I did want to just take a minute and give folks another 60 seconds or so to hop on. We're at about a third of the way into the number of attendees that are expected to join. And we know that not everybody generally may use WebEx regularly, so we're giving folks a little bit of extra time to get that application updated and sign on. So appreciate everyone's patience. We'll come back on in about a minute and move forward with our session today. 2 past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thanks so much for joining. My name is Masa FACCNE. I'm a partner and co-chair of the Immigration Practice Group here at Seyfarth. I've been in the space of immigration and compliance for the last almost 25 years and have kind of gone through both the benefits side with visas and processing through that, as well as compliance with I-9 audits, investigations, and Department of Labor ones as well. We're really looking forward to going through this presentation with you. I'm going to let Leon introduce himself, one of our partners who's on the call and will be speaking today as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leon Rodriguez. Like Mas, I'm a partner in the Business Immigration Group here at Seyfarth. I joined Seyfarth after having served as Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. I served in that role at a time when President Obama directed us to greatly expand the DACA program to include parents of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, and to increase the volume of refugee admissions to the United States. That followed a career that was mostly spent as a state and federal prosecutor in New York City, at Main Justice, and in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And now, in addition to my work at Seyfarth, I'm on the board of HIAS, a Jewish community-based refugee resettlement organization, on an advisory board of the Migration Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Leon. And we're also have a wonderful guest speaker as well, Dawn, who's one of our other partners, and she will be discussing the cultural flashpoints part of this session. Dawn.
Thank you. So great to be here. Thank you everyone for attending. I am a partner in Seyfarth's Boston office in our Labor and Employment Department. I'm an employment litigator and counselor with a special focus on trials and appeals. And I have the honor of co-chairing our Cultural Flashpoints Task Force along with my colleague Sam Schwartz-Fenwick. And this is a task force that we developed in 2023 to help employers with the sort of polarizing issues that are increasingly affecting the workplace. And I'm just delighted to be here for this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Dawn and Leon. So our agenda is pretty simple in the way that we've laid it out. We're going to let Dawn kind of talk through a lot of these high points related to cultural flashpoints that are impacting companies across industries, across the nation in different ways. From that, we'll segue into a discussion on immigration and really focus on kind of what did it look like, knowing that the administration that's incoming in a few days, we've already had a run with them, and we already kind of have an idea of what it looks like in terms of impact on immigration, what it looks like right now, and what we think it will look like based on our past experiences. And we'll spend some time talking through some day one considerations and then looking into the months and years ahead as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn for her to talk through the cultural flashpoints.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So next slide. Let's just talk for a moment about what we mean by cultural flashpoints. As I said, our group was founded with a recognition that the polarization that is very much out there in society is also in the workplace. There's really no workplace that's immune from these forces. We ask employees to bring their whole self to work, and when they do, they bring strong opinions about lots of different issues, and often those are divergent opinions. Sometimes between offices, within the same company in different states, you can have vast disagreements within the workplace, but sometimes even within the very same office. And some of those issues include political expression. We obviously just had a very contentious election and are kind of on the eve of a new administration. And so a lot of times that political expression comes inside the workplace. Also challenges to DE&I programs, which are very much in the headlines today. Religious expression is a major source of flashpoints, which sometimes come into conflict with other protected classes, in particular LGBTQ issues. We are still battling COVID-related flashpoints inside the workplace. So, for example, political views about vaccination policies is a ripe one that's led to a lot of litigation that we're defending around the country. Me Too issues and Black Lives Matter issues, so social movements that, again, can't be completely divorced from the workplace. LGBTQ rights, as I mentioned, which sometimes are in conflict with religious expression, and a huge issue that arose after we founded the Flashpoints group, but has really created an avalanche of questions from employers, is fallout from October 7th, the Israel-Hamas war that is, of course, very much ongoing. And so, all of these flashpoints create disputes within the workplace sometimes. They may pit protected classes against each other. And we often see questions around even off-duty conduct that may impact the workplace. So an employee who takes to X or to their Facebook page to express maybe a political point of view or a view about the Israel-Hamas war. And sometimes that too affects the workplace because we don't have these clear boundaries that we maybe used to have, right, between what is off duty and what is on duty. People bring their phone to work. People may be Facebook friends with their coworkers. Their business tweets and their personal tweets may get jumbled at times. And so sometimes we're seeing employers who have, employee who's bringing a screenshot into HR and saying, this is what I just saw on my colleague's social media account. And I think that this is creating a hostile work environment. And that obviously puts the employer in a position of having to handle these flashpoints, even if the conduct, allegedly occurred off duty. Next slide. And, so flashpoints really have the potential to create a lot of exposure and risk for employers. And one of the things we are always careful to note is that we are, of course, lawyers. We are not DE&I consultants. We are not historians, with decades of knowledge about, for example, Middle East conflict. But we really are focused on helping our clients to think about legal risk and how to minimize that legal risk. Next slide. And when we talk about potential exposure from flashpoints, we're of course not talking just about potential damages awards from litigation, but also damage to company reputation, particularly around in an era where the minute something happens online, the employer can get tagged to it and be sort of overwhelmed with an avalanche of negative publicity. Also just distraction from the business goals, right? If your employees are on Slack fighting about a global conflict, they are not focused on the work that they're supposed to be doing. And it also can impact morale and even lead to a loss of talent, of retention of talent, if people feel that they're in a workplace that is intolerant of their ideas or even hostile to their protected classification. Next slide. So on the Flashpoints task force, what we help clients do is to create a custom framework that really helps them think about how to handle these flashpoints. Next slide. And that's kind of a combination of a couple of different factors. One, of course, is the law, and we'll talk just briefly. I could talk about this forever, but we've got limited time today. I'll just touch it kind of a high level. But the legal framework that is in place for these kinds of flashpoints. But then also, and what makes the framework unique, I think, to each organization is that it really is also going to depend on what the organization's values and policies are. What is the company's mission? What is their, what are some of their values, such as around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Maybe some organizations are in an industry where they can't really be agnostic about global conflicts, because of the nature of the business. So that's really going to vary from organization to organization. And then also, what are the policies? And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but what policies are in place that might inform how a company reacts to some of these flashpoints? So what does our social media policy look like? What is the, do we have a respectful workplace policy? And is that compliant with the current rules? And even just what does the anti-discrimination policy look like? And so one of the first questions that we'll often take up with an employer who calls us for advice is sort of, can you give us a sense of what your policy framework looks like so that we can think about what might make sense for your organization? Next slide. So just in terms of sort of brass tacks, what kinds of questions do we get regularly from clients around flashpoints? One category is religious accommodation flashpoints. This is an area that I've had specialization in for decades, and I always say that it used to be a very sleepy little area of the law until 2021, when it just absolutely exploded, in part because of mandatory vaccination policies that some employers adopted and people seeking exemptions from those policies. But since then, we've really seen just a huge uptick in religious accommodation requests and litigation arising out of them way beyond COVID. And for example, requests to be exempt from DE&I programming or diversity training, or non-discrimination training, or using colleagues' preferred pronouns. Really kind of a whole gamut of flashpoints related issues on that. We talked a little bit about off-duty conduct. That continues to be a challenge. There's a lot of litigation that's being litigated right now that's coming out of discipline or terminations based on off-duty conduct. Political expression. I sometimes get the question that, well, the election is over. Do you still anticipate flashpoints in 2025? And the answer is yes, absolutely. They have not slowed down one bit, and expect with the new administration and change administration that they will only accelerate. A lot of flashpoints questions around hiring. So, for example, we all saw the headlines about encampments on college campuses, and we've had a lot of questions from employers who may want to hear what their options are in terms of not hiring people who were involved in those encampments or in other kinds of protests on campus, or just generally have been involved in a political campaign that the hiring manager may not view favorably. DE&I challenges, again, this is sort of ripped from the headlines. Lots of companies that are sort of wrestling with how to manage new challenges to their DE&I programs. And then a lot of questions around employee resource groups. So, for example, after October 7th, questions around various faith-based employee resource groups, whether dedicated to a particular religion or to just sort of a faith-based group more generally. And we see these conflicts erupt in, sometimes it's one-on-one conversations between employees. Sometimes it's an off-sites or travel where people feel a little bit more free to express their personal views. We see kind of almost any place where an employee could insert political expression or views on Flashpoints, we've seen it. So sometimes it's Zoom backgrounds where people will put on their Zoom background, I stand with Israel or Free Gaza. Lots of conflict on Slack and Jabber channels where I think people feel like it's a little bit more of an informal format than email. Physical displays in offices, cubicles, and particularly around the election, but beyond that, questions about political or other kinds of flashpoints, attire, every permutation of that, hats, pins, flags, and sometimes around outside speakers at events who may come in ostensibly to talk about a particular issue that affects the workplace, but kind of use the platform to express a view on a Flashpoints topic. Next slide. So, again, we can't get into all of the legal ramifications of Flashpoints, but just to give a very broad view, we typically will look at sort of 3 buckets of laws that may affect these issues. The first is Title VII, which of course is the federal anti-discrimination, anti-harassment laws that protect employees in various protected categories: gender, race, national origin, religion, and others. And then the state law analogs to Title VII that are basically the state law anti-discrimination statutes. And then secondly, the National Labor Relations Act, which protects some forms of employee speech and collective action. Importantly, not just for unionized workplaces, but for any workplace. That's sometimes a fact that people aren't aware of. And then also state laws outside of the anti-discrimination framework. There increasingly are state laws around off-duty conduct, political expression. And so when a client calls with a counseling question on one of these Flashpoints, we are typically kind of running through the various issues in each of these 3 legal buckets to help the employer assess risk and find the path forward that works best for them. Next slide, please. So, this program is looking ahead to 2025. And like I said, I think there will be no shortage of Flashpoints in 2025. We certainly saw a huge uptick in 23 and 24, but we expect that trend to continue and even accelerate in this year. Of course, the ongoing war and war with a possible S in the Middle East continues to expand, continues to be very polarizing. I know today many of us are following the news about a possible ceasefire and hostage deal. That continues to be a flashpoint that is very salient for many employers. The Senate confirmation hearings that are currently just getting started, these raise issues around sexual assault, around gender, and around vaccines and other issues. And so that may give rise to, conversation between employees on some of these hot topics. Immigration, which of course my friends here are going to speak on in a lot more depth, but to the extent that we see travel bans, rhetoric around immigration like we saw in the campaign, and that may be put into action coming soon, that's certainly something that touches on national origin, on religion, and can certainly be a flashpoint. Gender affirming care and transgender rights, also a major factor in the election, and will continue to be a factor in the Supreme Court and sort of legislative battles. And that again, I've had so many questions about people, particularly with social media postings on some of these topics, which are, of course, very controversial. All of that leads to debates around gender, race, diversity. And I think just more generally, there's an anti-corporate sentiment that really crosses both political parties that continues to, be a Flashpoints challenge for many employers. Next slide.
Dawn, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of what employers say and do, separate and apart from their business mission, but what they say more as a matter of sort of company values, uh, with regard to some of these very flashpoints, and what are sort of areas of danger, what are areas of opportunity from a legal perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, a lot of employers really, especially for example, in the George Floyd murder and other issues, felt really compelled to come forward with corporate statements about some of these sort of hot button topics, and felt really, kind of mission driven to make statements on certain things. And many did issue statements immediately after October 7th. I think since then, I think that there is a little more hesitation on the part of many employers to wade into some of this territory. We saw, for example, some of the universities who kind of issued a statement saying that we're no longer going to comment on public issues unless they immediately impact our actual business or our actual mission. And I think that that is increasingly something that many companies are adopting as a kind of, we're not necessarily going to wade into these waters. But there will be exceptions. And I think, one exception is that there are, some companies that are still very much willing to, speak out about, for example, celebrating Pride Month or other DE&I priorities that are consistent with their DE&I program. And they may even be willing to wade into some of these more polarizing issues if, for example, there's something about their particular, corporate mission or institutional mission, or they're a nonprofit that, feels compelled to speak on, even polarizing topics, then they can certainly do that and do. From a legal risk point of view, I think, a lot of it is just being sensitive to the way that message is going to land on employees, and as well as, other, investors, customers, and kind of just making sure to be really careful about how that statement is crafted and framed.
Thank you.
So in terms of policies, I talked a little bit about kind of that three-legged stool of how we suggest coming up with a framework for flashpoints, and that included the mission, the law, and then the policies. And I think that, one important takeaway from today is to make sure that you're really auditing your own policies to make sure that they are kind of up to the current moment. So, social media policy needs to be compliant with the National Labor Relations Act, as does any political expression or respectful workplace policy. Religious accommodation, I think that there are lots of companies that have a really robust disability accommodation policy that they've had forever and may not even have a religious accommodation policy. It's really time in 2025 to make sure that you're kind of up to speed on making sure that you have that policy in place and understand how to process and manage requests for religious accommodation. Discrimination, harassment, and EE&O. I mean, I think a lot of times what happens is when a flashpoint erupts in the workplace, the company sort of takes out their non-discrimination policy and looks at it and says, ugh, wish this said something about off-duty conduct, or I wish that this didn't kind of only contemplate conduct that's actually within the four brick walls of the corporate office. And so, if yours has not been dusted off for a while, it's a good idea to take a new look. Also, DE&I policies should be updated for the current moment to make sure that they are, compliant and resistant to some of the challenges we've seen, as well as policies about employee resource groups. Next slide. And then, as a sort of final thought, we often are recommending to clients that they think about having their own internal cultural flashpoints team. And that's because, rather than being reactive to individual flashpoints as they erupt, I think there's an opportunity to kind of think through, how are we going to handle these kinds of issues? What are we going to prioritize? How are we going to be consistent across these different flashpoints? And so sometimes it can be really helpful to bring together people from, say, your legal team, your people or HR teams, the recruiters, the corporate leaders. We have, some clients where the executive team wants to be part of this kind of internal cultural flashpoints group. Certainly the DE&I program leaders, employee relations, especially in a unionized workforce, and very importantly, PR, because a lot of these flashpoints issues will end up having PR implications. And so it can be great to bring those internal forces together to to think through how what the through line is as to how they're going to think about flashpoints issues. Sometimes we'll work with internal flashpoints teams to give them hypotheticals of actual counseling questions that we've had, so that they can think about how they would manage those inside their workplace. Final thought is that we are seeing more and more litigation around flashpoints issues. That does, of course, raise distinct issues from those in more ordinary employment litigation, in terms of special sensitivity as to how to avoid reputational harm while defending the case. Understanding that the plaintiffs bringing flashpoints related litigation may not have the same incentives as typical employment plaintiffs. It may be political or religious groups bringing some of these cases who are looking to make precedent. And these cases do carry an increased risk of a trend we're already seeing toward explosive verdicts, because they, are polarizing kind of emotional topics that, may hit a judge or jury differently than a more ordinary employment case. And with that, I will turn it back to my friends to talk about immigration issues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dawn. Actually, Andy, can you flip back to that last slide for a second? So this is why we're doing this together. So all these stakeholders that Dawn has identified here on this slide really apply in the immigration context as well, and what we talk through, especially now that we're trying to get ready for, are there going to be travel implications? Are there going to be implications if you are placing clients, if you're placing your folks at end clients, or if you have folks on your side as end clients, employee relations, the marketing, the PR of it. All of these different stakeholders are also really important in the context of immigration and what the next 4 years may hold for us. Next slide. And so with that in mind, we're going to be talking about that past, present, future I mentioned. Next slide. And I'm going to ask you, Leon, if you can talk to us about what the past looked like, the 2016-2020 period when we first had the Trump administration in place, and what changed in the last 4 years under the Biden administration and what today looks like. You may be on mute, Leon.
I was. As I think as we talk about how the first Trump administration governed versus how this current incoming Trump administration will govern, we need to look at a few points of evidence. One, obviously, what was done then is precedent for what will be done now. It's not necessarily definitive precedent, but it is to some degree precedent. What they've said is important. And then for me, one of the very most important things is who they've hired and who they've said they're going to hire. And notably, by the way, the Senate confirmation hearings began this morning for the incoming administration, with the confirmation hearings for Secretary of State. So very, very important to this discussion. who that is. Senator Marco Rubio, who is from Florida. While he is a core Republican in terms of his views on immigration, he's also from Florida. Actually, Miami, where he's from, happens to be my hometown. And it's a city 1/3 of whose population is foreign-born. It's the single city in the United States with the largest foreign-born population. And some not trivial portion of those foreign-born people are actually entirely undocumented persons. So that's already giving you some hint as to what's coming. Pam Bondi, another Floridian, is the nominee to be Attorney General. She started her confirmation hearing this morning as well. And so there is some immediate effort to start getting people into their positions, ready to start implementing President-elect Trump's agenda with respect to immigration. So what happened then and what happened now? And one, I think, key thing to pay attention to is that then President Trump in 2016 came to his job in many respects as a novice to governing. He had led before, he had led organizations, large organizations, but he had never led the federal government. And as somebody who has spent part of his life in the private sector and part of his life in the public, they are alike in many ways, and they are also fundamentally different in others. And also the political conditions that brought President Trump in the first time are somewhat different than the ones that brought him in now entering into 2025. So one thing that's in common between the two, the southwest border was a big issue back in 2016. When I entered on duty as director of USCIS by 2014, we were already seeing pretty unprecedented volumes of asylum seekers from Central America, the southwest border, and our resources were overtaxed, absorbing those volumes, adjudicating their claims of asylum, housing them, supervising them while they remained in the United States. One thing, though, that is very different is the view of employment-based immigration of the first Trump administration and the one that is incoming. A key theme of the first Trump campaign and also of the appointments made by then President Trump was a belief that the employment-based system lacked integrity and that it was operating to some degree to displace otherwise available U.S. workers. And for that reason, there were slowdowns in adjudication, and the adjudications became more difficult for employment-based immigration. Given some of what we've heard recently between Elon Musk and Steve Bannon and that part of President Trump's coalition, there is some indication that this administration may look different. There were travel restrictions. We may see those beginning Monday afternoon, right after inauguration. And there was certainly a slew of frequent policy updates, regulations, and litigation guidance. A lot of those things changed in the Biden administration. The sort of efforts to sort of slow down the process that we saw, those certainly were reversed in the Biden administration. One sort of great example is the way in which employment authorization document validity was extended in many cases up to 540 days. That had been a great cause of delay and of really obstruction in the system that was changed. So again, there were certainly pretty momentous changes in the Biden administration, many of which I think we're going to now see rolling back.
Yeah, and on the ground in the last 4 years, what we saw was improvement in terms of processing times, but also in terms of adjudication and requests for evidence. And that's been significant, right? Under the Trump administration, there were unprecedented volumes of requests for evidence when you file a petition, and the adjudicator has the discretion of asking for more documentation and information before making a decision that will ultimately approve or deny, or just automatically going through and based on the evidence on hand, issuing the decision. So that volume in terms of the Trump administration request for evidence was significantly high. And what that meant was, longer turn times before you could get these final approvals, before people could onboard with you, or before they had confirmation of that they could stay in the country. So it caused a lot of disruption and anxiety as well for the employees in particular. Under the Biden administration, those rates went down significantly. They reinstituted what we refer to as the deference policy, which basically says if your last H-1B was approved, for example, and for all intents and purposes and material facts and information remain the same, then we're giving deference to our last approval, and you are more likely than not be approved again. So we're not going to re-adjudicate everything from scratch. That was not the case under Trump, which is what led to a lot of the increases in the requests for evidence as well. So they re-implemented the deference policy and have now made it part of the regulations that are going to go in effect on January 17th, the H-1B modernization regulation. So that's helpful. So that will carry through. How it's implemented is the biggest question at the end of the day in the second term with this new administration coming in. And the customer service focus was in all Biden administration. That will probably be pulled back as well. And we saw that in the messaging on the USCIS website, for example, when the Trump administration came in, what they changed in the language was very clear what their focus was. It was not about customer service. It was about enforcement and ensuring integrity, et cetera. Whereas now when they updated this under the Biden administration, there was this much more focus on how do we make sure that our U.S. companies have the talent that they need, that the people who are applying are getting the service that they need to get to the benefits that they are allowed under the regulations. With all that said, as we move on to what we expect to happen in a few days, next slide. I think Leon has talked to a little bit of this, and what we're going to see will be a little bit the same, but a little bit different too. And Leon, can you expand a little bit further about your comments relating to kind of the support of employment-based immigration in particular, when we think about the Elon Musk commentary and who the USCIS director might be?
Yeah, so I want to tell a story. I want to start maybe by and tack a little bit back to the first Trump administration. So shortly before he was appointed as director of USCIS, I had lunch with Francis FACCNE, who was the first Trump director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And, we talked a little bit about what it's like to run USCIS, and we talked about what his priorities, and he said something to me that has always struck me. He said that he personally, his real mission was to, quote, protect U.S. workers, that he wasn't necessarily fully on board with the Trump administration priorities with respect to reducing refugee admissions, to its approach to the southwest border. But the main thing that for him was an area of priority was really, quote, protecting U.S. workers, which then sort of created a lot of these policies that Masa and I were talking about in the last slide. What I learned since, and what's played out in the last few weeks with the incoming administration, is that actually is not what President-elect Trump thought then or thinks now. President-elect Trump is somebody whose own businesses have used large numbers of admittedly lower skilled immigrant workers, particularly seasonal workers in what's called the H-2B categories, many of whom work in resort and hotel type industries. And then this all played out very publicly with Elon Musk, the chair of Tesla, saying that we actually need more higher skilled immigrant workers in the United States, that is something that is very necessary for our businesses. And very notably, President-elect Trump chimed in publicly and said, Musk is right. I use those types of workers myself. And that drew in some backlash from Steve Bannon, who was another key part of President-elect Trump's political coalition, suggesting that actually could be harmful to U.S. workers. But what all of this points to is that at the highest levels of the administration, there will not necessarily be the motivation to crack down on high-skilled immigration in the way that we saw in the first Trump administration. But there is one big trump card, and that is we still don't know who is going to be the director of USCIS. And that person has a lot of ability under the radar screen to really still be altering processes, altering regulations in a way that could really complicate the process for getting higher skilled professionals admitted to the United States, whether in sort of more temporary statuses like H-1B, which is for high skilled, so-called specialty occupation workers, L visa workers who are transferring from foreign branches of companies to the US. Those processes could still be complicated if you have a director or leadership at USCIS that is still very much of the philosophy that I was describing at the beginning of the conversation. So we don't know. We don't know what that's going to look like.
Yes, and then that's the biggest question. And the other thing to me that's telling, Leon, and is the fact that we've already heard the names for the other agencies, their sister agencies, the enforcement,
right.
And that's an interesting component too. But it follows what was heard throughout the campaign, right? And the fact that the border, the undocumented, the refugee crisis are all the ones that are played to in the media and what has been the focus, and perhaps that's why those are the names that have already been identified and shared.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really important because, there have certainly been some nominees who have been fodder for the late night talk show hosts, not the ones in immigration. So, for example, Tom Homan, who has been colloquially called the border czar, but who I think functionally will be the senior advisor to the president on immigration and border security. He's somebody who I've worked with. He was a senior official at Immigration and Customs Enforcement for many, many years, including during the Obama administration. If anybody knows how to operate the machinery of immigration enforcement and deportation, it is Tom Homan. And in turn, the people who are in line for appointment as directors of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the agency that carries out immigration enforcement and deportation, and customs and border protection, which polices the border, are both individuals who were senior officials, senior career officials at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and who, from what I can tell, were handpicked by Mr. Homan for those positions. So that shows a real commitment to prioritize not only immigration enforcement, but actual removal. In other words, when you hear about mass deportation, they are staffing up to the extent their resources permit them now. They are staffing up in a manner that is consistent with them being ready to go potentially on day one with accelerating deportation from the United States. What that means for businesses is whether we admit it to ourselves or not, there are large numbers of unauthorized workers who either working with falsified papers or fully in sight of their employers, or who are working for contractors who are not legally authorized to work in the United States, but are. Many of these people could start disappearing from our workforce very, very soon.
Right. And that's the part, that's the balance, depending on your organization, what industry you're in, what you do know or not know about your workforce. It's what we're trying not to be is alarmist when it's not necessary, right? But at the same time, we just want to be aware of what might be coming down and what the priority and the focus will be. So to the extent the focus is the border and the focus is identifying undocumented and deporting individuals, but you maybe don't have that as an issue in your industry and your work because of your workforce, but what you do have is the visas, the H-1Bs, the L-1s, the TNs. You know, that is still kind of a remains to be seen what's going to happen with that because of this, the different type of stakeholders involved here that we didn't have. We didn't have the Elon and the business factor at the first Trump to the extent we do now. And we think that we're hoping that may temper things for us, but we'll still see a slowdown because there's still factions within USCIS, right? The government employees who've been there for decades who lean one way or the other, who are emboldened, you know, to act in a certain way based on the administration in place. So still, you know, need to plan for it, need to think about it, need to convey that to your employees, your business leaders, that, you know, you're still going to get your H-1B most likely, 99%, but it might take a little bit longer. It might feel a little bit more painful, but we'll get there.
And if you'll allow me to editorialize for just a moment about that, a saying that I heard a few times during my service at USCIS, and it came from from the more senior folks who had been in the agency for many, many years, is the quote, "Every file is a lie." Meaning that it was the belief of many experienced immigration officers that pretty much every application for any immigration benefit contained lies. That it was just sort of the nature of their work. And so that is a belief that then conditions certain behaviors by adjudicating officers. Some of those behaviors are regulated pretty effectively by leadership, but sometimes they're not. And so when there is a sense that an enforcement-focused leadership is coming in that is sort of favorable to that point of view, that almost immediately emboldens adjudicating officers to look with a yet more aggressive eye on the paperwork that's in front of them. That's true for employment-based immigration visas. That's also true for any other kind of immigration benefit.
Very true. Yeah. So things to think about. Next slide. But one of the highlights that we wanted to make sure we touch on in this session is what's expected based on the chatter in terms of travel restrictions. And Leon, if you can talk to this a little bit in terms of what we are hearing. The information here is and the countries listed are based on the first travel ban that was implemented during Trump 1. But you know, kind of what we're expecting to happen.
Yeah, so we certainly have heard one of just sort of overall large volumes of executive orders, but then we have heard that many of the types of travel bans that we saw in the first Trump administration will be reinstated again. You know, here you see the ones that were included in the first one. We can expect exactly the same group, although Syria may be a little different now. Given the changes there, and you know, don't be surprised to see countries come in and come out. Some other countries here, Nigeria, Myanmar, several others. Now there will always be exceptions in these bans. There certainly were the first time around, and there will be mechanisms for invoking those exceptions. But this will have some impact on some people if, in fact, it comes into effect. We have been hearing from credible sources about this going into effect actually by day one. Some of these are particularly consequential to businesses, Iran among them, because there are actually a not trivial number of higher skilled professionals who come from Iran seeking to either study or to seek advanced professional training or to actually work in the United States. Nigeria is another one that generates significant, meaningful numbers of professionals who then try to come to study in the West somewhere. And so that's that is something to watch, and something that we are expecting, and something where companies that may be affected will need to give some thought to how they invoke these exceptions that are going to be in these executive orders. Then there's consular behavior. I think I'm gonna bounce that one back to you, Mas, as far as what we can see from the Department of State and what we need to do to be ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the context of the travel bans, though, what businesses should be thinking about and talking through with Immigration Council is really about how do we convey and message to our business leaders and our employees who may be impacted what this means, how we may want to delay travel or pause any sort of international travel for folks who may be impacted. For a good 4 to 6 weeks, we have been telling our clients, if you have people who are traveling internationally for business or pleasure, have them back in country before January 20th, and have them plan on sticking around for weeks to months as we see how this unfolds and get a better sense of what's going on, because executive orders take effect. They can be immediate. Like if you're not back in the country, you're stuck there. So it's really important to be aware of that. And to Leon's point about the Iranian nationals or the Nigerian nationals, many of them have Canadian residence and citizenship, and they make their way to the US based on that. So people oh, that's not a big deal because I'm Canadian, I can just go back and forth. It's not based on where you're a citizen of, it's based on your country of birth. So, I've had a lot of conversations with Canadian citizens who are, Iranian born or Nigerian born about, let's not travel. Let's make sure you're back in country. It doesn't matter that you don't need to go to the consulate and get a visa stamp because you're a Canadian citizen. The travel ban may still impact you. But the Department of State in particular, it's more of like benign or non-benign neglect in terms of removing resources, removing visa appointment availability, increasing security clearances or extreme vetting in particular, which was one that was a favorite of under the first Trump administration. And what that means is if someone has to leave the country and to come back, they have to get a new visa stamp that allows them re-entry into the country. They're going to go to the consulates, they're going to submit their applications, and may or may not experience backlogs and delays, whether it's because the resources at the Department of State are depleted and it's taking them longer, or they're being selected for additional security clearances or extreme vetting. And so if someone's making a trip and a plan abroad, you should really think a few steps ahead. What happens if I can't come back in 2 weeks like I had planned, but instead I'm stuck at administrative processing for a month or 2 months? We had one gentleman stuck for a year. He's in the UK, so he could work remotely from there, and it wasn't an issue. But he was stuck abroad for a year before his visa was issued. And the consulates really have wide discretion, under the banner of security. Obviously, and it makes sense, but they have wide discretion. They don't have to be fully transparent. We don't always know why people are being held up. And there's only, so much that anybody can do. Even getting congressional liaisons involved doesn't always, move the needle in that component. And CBP and increased scrutiny of the border is kind of something we've mentioned along the way is a given, because that's always been at the top of the list for the Trump administration, previous and future one coming in. Next slide. The other area where we're expecting to see and a quick and immediate uptick is well, what's not on here is this expectation of these mass deportations that has been, the biggest thing in the media. And maybe Leon, if you can talk to that a little bit, and then we can talk about I-9s.
Yeah, no, so this was an area where there was a stark difference from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration. This is also kind of low-hanging fruit for them. And so on the eve of the pandemic, and this was only slowed down by the pandemic. In other words, we don't even know what it would have been like had the pandemic not sort of come into the picture. But there were 7,500 notices of inspection issued in the first quarter of 2020. And those ended up being kind of complicated a bit by the pandemic, but they were a five-fold increase of the pace that we were used to seeing before that. What these mean, because not everybody in this group necessarily has to live this stuff. These are reviews of the forms that employees prepare to certify their immigration status. And as part of which employers need to review documents of identity and work authorization, whether they be passports, driver's licenses, green cards, work authorization cards, et cetera, to confirm that these individuals are authorized to work in the United States. These are inspected on a semi-random basis by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so we fully expect that to be increased and for it to potentially be coupled with, at least for certain kinds of industries, with actual workplace raids, should those reviews of documentation yield evidence of a meaningful number of authorized workers in a particular workplace. I should say parenthetically, the way that this process could turn up evidence of unauthorized workers is inspectors are trained to tell whether the documentation that those workers have presented is actually authentic or whether it is falsified documentation. If they see significant numbers of what are called suspect documents, that in turn could become the impetus for some sort of workplace enforcement action. Having said all that, it takes a lot of resources to do these things. Right now, these kinds of resources are fully employed, fully deployed. It'll take some time for the new administration to acquire, and it'll take some back and forth with Congress in terms of funding to see whether these resources really do come in the end. So there's going to be more. How much more, I think, is something that still remains to be determined really by Congress, depending on how much they're willing to pay for.
Right, and I think some of the things to highlight here in terms of what we hear in the media a lot and what has people concerned is these commentary on these promised mass deportations and the numbers, Holman throws out there of how many people they're going to round up and deport. And what to remember there in the context of what Leon just shared, it is about resources. It is about logistics of doing a raid and pulling people and where are they going to get them from and who are they prioritizing and why. Is it people who are already in the system because of some sort of criminal violation and that's what they're going to first? But if an organization or company is not already under an audit investigation, unlikely that they would just all of a sudden tomorrow or on the 20th or the 21st be targeted and someone comes in knocking on your door and deporting people, right? But if you're already under an audit or already under an investigation, those are the initial targets most likely that the agencies will be going after. What is important to also highlight here is we will go back to kind of the more audacious type of actions, right? So where we're seeing them come on site, they've identified a group of people and it becomes a big PR thing for them, right? And we saw this under the Bush administration, right? If you've been around long enough and remember, they used to come with their ice jackets and their weapons and come in and raid and deport hundreds and hundreds of people. And we saw that go away under the Obama administration. We obviously haven't seen it under the Biden administration. Under the first Trump administration, that's when we saw this kind of uptick, the significant one that Leon mentioned, where by the end of the administration, there were over about 5,200 I-9 notices of inspection issued across multiple countries and companies. And, there were on-site raids as well. So more likely than not, we will see a return to that. And we have one of our partners, Don Lurie, who also sits in DC with Leon, is actually working through a blog. So if you're not subscribed to our blog, subscribe to our blog, because a lot of this history and information and what's coming down the pike will be part of this upcoming blog post that we're gonna put up there. But most importantly, just if you haven't looked at and if you're not sure what your I-9s look like, what your compliance policy looks like, it's a good time to do that now. And then if you're not sure who's on your site in terms of people being placed on your site, that's the other area where we're going to start seeing on-site visits, not just from Immigration and Customs Enforcement related to I-9s, but from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Fraud Unit, FDNS, coming on site to validate H-1Bs and L-1s. And they may be your H-1Bs or they may be the H-1Bs of your vendors who, if they've been placed on site. So that's one thing that we haven't really focused on as much, especially in the last 4 years, because it hasn't been a big thing, but we've definitely seen an uptick in the last 6 months, 6 to 8 months, even before this administration, coming in, we've seen that uptick. So a lot of things to think about and talk through. Next slide.
Yeah, let me,
Yeah.
and so there's a question about temporary protected status that I'd like to answer real quick. And what's going to happen with workers in that category in certain industries where large numbers of them are employed. Temporary protected status is a status that protects individuals from deportation and provides them work authorization when they are nationals of a country that has experienced some sort of major either natural catastrophe or human-created catastrophe, like a war or something like that. A number of countries, nationals benefit from that: Haiti, Venezuela, El Salvador, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine. All are subject to temporary protected, their nationals are subject to temporary protected status. There was a lot of effort in the first Trump administration to roll those statuses back. And we are hearing signs of the same with the incoming administration. And I think one of the questions here is who's at risk and who's not. I think all of the grants are at risk. I'll answer that one immediately. I think whether it will happen immediately or gradually, it will happen. It will certainly not happen from one day to the next. In other words, either the administration will allow the grants to expire whenever they reach they're done in cycles of 18 months. So whenever they reach the end of the cycle, they'll let them expire, or they will actively seek to revoke them. And there is a statutory process that takes some time to execute in order to successfully revoke them. Inevitably, the administration will be sued when they try to do that. And inevitably, they will be sued in either New York or California, where they know they are likely to have friendly judges who, at least at the district court lower level, forget about what happens when they get to the Supreme Court, will likely be friendly to their position with respect to these immigration categories.
Thanks, Leon. In the interest of time, I will confirm El Salvador, Venezuela, Sudan, and Ukraine were extended for 18 months by the Biden administration. It's one of their final few gifts that they're giving us as they're walking out the door. But the litigation component is huge, and that's what stopped a lot of things that the Trump administration tried to put through in the first term. But these are the questions you should be asking, talking about, thinking about, and all the stakeholders in Dawn's earlier slide are the ones who are involved in really addressing these questions. So there really is a lot of planning, communications. This is very anxiety driven for the individuals involved, obviously. And if you're not subscribed to our blog, a lot of these updates we give through the blog, the TPS updates we give through the blog. We'll share the deck after the session, and we'll include the link to our blog as well. I highly recommend that you subscribe to that, just to have, especially now, because we're going to see a lot of these updates and changes and impact on workforce coming through. And so with that, we appreciate everybody joining us. Thank you, Dawn, for joining us as well and presenting. And you all have a great day.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.